This section on the cardiovascular system chapter on the vasculature will look at how the vasculature is regulated, specifically blood pressure. We'll see how blood pressure is regulated through a series of responses, both short-term and long-term, to keep blood pressure within a homeostatic control. This figure provides an overview of what goes into regulating blood pressure. There's two aspects we want to look at. There's autoregulation, and then there's the neural and endocrine components. To begin with, autoregulation is how the blood vessels regulate themselves, which is exactly what autoregulation means. There are an array of sensors within the blood vessel wall that are paying attention to various chemical signals and physical changes in the blood vessels, which will cause either vasodilation or vasoconstriction. Vasodilation is going to open blood vessels, make their diameters wider, which will increase blood flow, and vasoconstrictors will narrow the blood vessels and therefore decrease blood flow. The autoregulation will also include control of the capillary sphincters, and when they relax, that'll increase blood flow through the capillaries, and when they constrict, that'll limit the amount of blood that gets into the capillary bed, which just goes along with the vasodilation and vasoconstriction of the blood vessels in general. Capillaries don't have their own tunica media to control their diameters. When autoregulation, which could potentially make changes immediately, doesn't have the proper effect on blood pressure, then other homeostatic mechanisms are going to take over. And those are going to be the ones that we're familiar with from this course: the autonomic nervous system and the endocrine system. The autonomic nervous system, or the neural mechanism as this figure is putting it, is responding to both changes in blood pressure and blood chemistry. Both of those go through the cardiac centers in the medulla. We already looked at the cardiovascular center, which has to do with cardiac output, but this is a different region in the same general area called the vasomotor center, and it'll have an effect to stimulate sympathetic or parasympathetic responses, to adjust cardiac output, and to have an effect on blood pressure because of that. The endocrine control is centered across four major organ systems. The kidneys have their role to play, both in controlling the production of red blood cells, which can affect the viscosity of blood and therefore blood flow, and a system called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone axis. Then the adrenal gland, specifically the adrenal medulla, will release catecholamines, which is really referring to epinephrine and related signaling molecules. Then the brain can release ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, which will have an effect on the amount of water in plasma and therefore blood pressure and blood volume. And then the heart can release hormone called atrial natriuretic hormone, or ANH, which is the heart's way of responding to changes in blood pressure and keeping them under control so that pressure doesn't get too high in the heart. The renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system is an important system to understand blood pressure regulation. In this picture, it's highlighted along with the sympathetic division's way of dealing with blood pressure. And really the two work together. The sympathetic or neural input will control short-term changes, while the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system can handle long-term changes. And by long-term, that can actually not mean necessarily lifelong, but over extended periods of time, definitely. Now, renin is a hormone that comes from the kidneys. The name renin has as its root rene, as in renal, and probably should be pronounced renin, but most people pronounce it renin. Don't be confused with another word with the same pronunciation, but that's spelled R-E-N-N-I-N. That renin is an enzyme in the stomach, which we'll talk about in the digestive system. Usually you'll hear renin in conjunction with angiotensin to establish that that's the kidney endocrine system response. So the kidneys produce renin, which then leads to a series of changes that activates a molecule called angiotensin II. Angiotensin II by itself is a very potent vasoconstrictor, and so it will raise blood pressure. The kidneys want to raise blood pressure because they usually have to get involved in this when blood pressure drops and blood perfusion through the kidneys is underperforming and waste products can't be filtered out of the blood appropriately. So renin eventually is going to cause increases in blood pressure, and angiotensin does that directly as a vasoconstrictor. It will also stimulate the release of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. Aldosterone will tell the kidneys to retain more sodium from the filtrate, which is going to end up causing more water to stay in the blood as well, and that'll increase blood volume and that'll increase blood pressure as well. Antidiuretic hormone is part of that series of responses also, coming from the brain, the hypothalamus specifically, released through the posterior pituitary. Antidiuretic hormone tells the kidneys directly to retain water, which will also increase blood volume and therefore blood pressure. We will revisit the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone axis when we get to the chapter on the urinary system and look at the kidneys in more detail. In looking at the blood a couple of chapters back, we learned about how we stop blood loss from continuing through blood clotting, or hemostasis. But after the blood clot has done its job, the blood that is lost needs to be replaced. And so there are some factors that play into that are related to the blood pressure and blood volume controls that we're looking at here. With blood loss, there will be a drop in blood volume, which will necessarily mean that there's a drop in blood pressure. And so again, there's an endocrine and a neural mechanism to go with this. The endocrine system has to do with, again, retaining water from the kidneys through ADH and aldosterone, constricting blood vessels to accommodate a smaller volume of blood to some extent, and EPO, which will increase the production of red blood cells. All of that's going to bring blood volume up. The neural system will stimulate the medullary centers through the cardiovascular center and the vasomotor center, all of which are going to both increase cardiac output. Moving more blood around quicker will make it seem like blood volume's up, as well as dealing with vasoconstriction. The blood pressure will go up, and the venous reserve, blood that's kept in the veins, which makes up about 2/3 of what's available in circulation, will be pushed into circulation again to make up for some of that drop in volume, which can be quicker than the endocrine system's responses to get blood volume up. Let's take a minute to think about the medullary centers. Now, we already talked about them before in terms of cardiac output, but there's a little bit more to be said when we consider blood pressure regulation too. The cardiovascular center that we looked at in terms of cardiac output is made up of the cardiac inhibitory centers and the cardiac acceleratory centers. But there's additionally what's called the vasomotor center, which is specifically controlling the muscle tissue in the walls of blood vessels, which is exactly what vasomotor is referring to. When there's an increase in blood pressure, baroreceptors, stretch receptors essentially, in the blood vessel walls will send signals that will increase cardiac inhibition, decrease cardiac acceleration, and decrease effects on those vessel muscle cells. All of that will end up decreasing cardiac output through heart rate and stroke volume changes coming from the cardiovascular center, as well as increasing vasodilation, which is the opposite of what the vasomotor center is controlling, sort of the relaxation of the blood vessel walls, all of which is going to cause a drop in blood pressure. When blood pressure goes down, the baroreceptors are less stimulated by stretch, and so they fire less, and the signals there will end up causing the cardiac inhibitor centers to decrease activity, cardiac accelerators to increase, the two of which will cause cardiac output to go up. And then the vasomotor centers will also be activated, which will cause the vessel wall smooth muscle to contract and therefore lead to vasoconstriction, all of which is going to increase blood pressure. Consider this question. When you feel that you've reached an answer, hit the next button to go into the next slide, which will reveal the correct answer. These four hormones, atrial natriuretic hormone, angiotensin II, aldosterone, and ADH, are all going to be involved in regulating blood pressure. ANH is different from the other three because it lowers blood pressure. It's the heart's way of saying blood pressure is too high, back off so that the heart doesn't take on too much blood at once. All of the others are there to increase blood pressure, which is really so that the kidneys can do their job to clear waste out of the blood. But there needs to be a control on that, and that's what's coming from the atria of the heart, which is the first part of the heart that's getting blood back, and if it stretches, then it releases its hormone as a feedback mechanism to keep blood pressure in check.